Hi everybody, and welcome to the latest video in our series looking at AQA Unit 2S, the making of modern Britain. We're continuing to look in this video at the Wilson years from 1964 to 1970, the years of Labour government, and our focus this time is looking at some social developments. This will be the first of two videos on society during the 1960s. One of the key aspects that you need to be aware of, and this is picking up really from what we said about society and social change in the 50s, is the growth of leisure activities. This was something that we'd already seen to an extent in the 1950s, but it expands even further into the 1960s. By the 60s, there's less of an expectation on a lot of people that they should be working on a Saturday morning. Increasingly, people have most of the weekend or the entire weekend free. These were the days before Sunday shopping, for example, so a lot of workplaces were closed on the Sunday. A lot of people had a free weekend, and inevitably that means that leisure activities become increasingly accessible. It's not always the case that people have to travel far for those activities. A lot of it's taking place at home. Don't forget that for many people, TV is still a novelty. It may only be a year or two since they first bought their TV set. And surveys showed that about 23% of leisure time was made up simply by watching television. Things like DIY and gardening, the sorts of things that we take for granted today, people increasingly have time to do those things, cooking, knitting and so on, needlework, some of those things which people of course could do while they were watching TV were popular activities as well. Quite interesting though, because as leisure activities increasingly take place within the home, some live events become less popular. So for example, there are fewer people going regularly to the theatre. That's particularly the case once you move outside the big cities. It's also the case even that things like attending a football match or the live events, concerts and so on becomes a little bit less common. Not to say that nobody does it, but it's slightly less common than it had been in previous decades. Once again, as we said in the 50s, and this is even more true in the 60s, the affordability of cars has a really significant social impact. Cars are increasingly affordable. Inevitably then, far more people own a car as you get towards 1970, and the inevitable result of that is that fewer people are using the bus or the train. And that statistic, it's slightly outside our period, but only just. It tells its own story. You've got over 3/4 of journeys done by car by 1974. Compare that to 39% in 1954. We can see the pace of change over those 20 years. And of course, the knock-on impact of that is really quite significant too. So for example, new shopping centres out of town are opening up because people can get there in the car. And also some of those leisure activities that do take place outside the home, things like caravanning, for example, and golf, become increasingly easy to access. A couple of other points to make about leisure before we move on. Obviously, leisure is something that people do in their private lives, but of course there's a massive industry around it, and a growing industry, and an increasingly profitable industry as well. We talked when we looked at 1950 society about the growth of advertising, and once again advertising really booms in the 60s, and what we end up with is shopping, something which people had seen as a necessity. There would be the daily shop, usually undertaken by women. All of a sudden, shopping in itself and going for an afternoon out shopping and it somehow being fun, it becomes a leisure activity in its own right. And that link between the growth of car ownership, the growth of the advertising industry, mass production of some of these goods, the growth of leisure, all of that is very closely tied together. Something else to be aware of is that far more people are going on holiday in the 60s than in previous decades, and it's partly the result of some of that affluence that we talked about in the 1950s, and it's true in terms of both foreign holidays and holidays in Britain as well. People are undertaking more of both. You get this new airline, Britannia Airways, in 1964, and that's very much for holidaymakers, particularly people going for a relatively low budget holiday to Bulgaria, the Canaries, to Spain and so on. Having said all of that, don't be fooled into thinking that pretty much everybody's going abroad. They're not. It's still mainly the preserve of the middle classes. And even by 1971, although package holidays have grown quite substantially, still accounts for only 8% of holidays. A lot of working class people may well be having more holidays than they used to, but they're still more likely to be holidaying in Britain. One interesting thing that we do get is the beginning of the growth of what you might call trendy bars back in Britain. People, particularly middle class people, going abroad and then quite enjoying going to wine bars as opposed to more traditional pubs, enjoying some of the food they're eating in France or Spain or wherever, and they quite want to taste it when they get back home as well, which is why we see a growth not only in wine bars but increasingly in restaurants which are serving foreign food, European food, as opposed to more traditional food. So as we've said before, when we're looking at leisure, a lot of factors tied together, a lot of these things like car ownership, affluence, the ability to go on holiday and so on, very closely linked together. Something else which we began to talk about in the 1950s, and again is an even bigger social change in the 60s, is the growth of the mass media, and TV is at the heart of that. It's absolutely the case in the 60s that TV has really replaced cinema as the primary way that people access their entertainment. Back in the 30s and the 40s, cinema was huge. Cinema's still big, but TV has very much taken over by the 60s. Interesting statistic there, by 61, you've got 3/4 of British people have a TV in their home. By the end of the decade, it's grown to over 90%. So you can see that TV is no longer something that only a few people have. It's the norm for the vast majority of people. And what you get because of that is a sense of cultural cohesion. We're experiencing a little bit at the moment with things like Line of Duty, for example. Everybody seems to be talking about it. Apologies if you're watching this video a couple of years on and you don't know what I'm talking about here. But this idea that we're all watching the same stuff. It's particularly true back in the 60s where there are very few channels. And so there's a sense that TV is bringing people together. And if you live in a remote bit of the UK and you've got a TV, it somehow links you to the rest of the country in a way that perhaps you wouldn't have been linked before. Quite an important figure here, a man called Hugh Green. Now, Hugh Green becomes Director General, basically the boss of the BBC in 1960, and he is determined to modernise television. And he does various things. First of all, he realises TV is the future, and increasingly a lot of money that had been pumped into radio, Hugh Green diverts into television instead. And Hugh Green believes that the existing guidelines on nudity, on swearing, are far too conservative, and he begins to relax those. He also is a populist, which is to say he absolutely believes that the BBC should be educating and informing people, but he doesn't see anything wrong with there being a bit more entertainment in what the BBC is producing as well. If you were to go back and watch the news from 1950, for example, you would find it was extremely formal, the way that it was done. And Hugh Green introduces a slightly more informal style. This is not presenters sitting on tables, but it is just a bit less formal than it was before. A really important development we talked about before was ITV, which of course had adverts in a way that the BBC didn't. Now that had been created back in 1955, and clearly that gave a massive boost to the advertising industry, and that continues throughout the 60s. And increasingly some of these big brand names become so familiar, and that's partly thanks to ITV. The really big brand names, Heinz, for example, everybody knows it, Cadbury's and so on, because ITV is beaming those names into people's homes. One of the other key developments in TV is the creation of BBC Two, the third channel, would you believe, in 1964. And BBC Two is at the time very much about information, about education, and that just frees BBC One up to become a bit more about entertainment, to become increasingly populist, as Hugh Green wants. Interestingly, though, it's BBC Two rather than BBC One, which takes what's a big step forward at the time, which is broadcasting in colour. So the move away from black and white begins. Another aspect of social change in the 1960s is to do with the issue of censorship. Now, this is an issue that we've explored in previous videos looking at society. You might remember, for example, the Lady Chatterley trial, which was very much around issues of censorship and freedom of expression. And that issue is raised as the 1960s goes on, and particularly when it comes to the theatre. Now, this might be quite hard to believe, but up until 1968, if you were a playwright, if you were a theatre owner, and you wanted to put on a new play at a British theatre, then you had to get a licence, you had to get permission from what's called the Lord Chamberlain's office. The Lord Chamberlain is an ancient figure. I don't mean he himself is 500 years old, but the position is centuries old. Somebody who has worked for the monarch across the centuries. So the idea that you have to get permission from this particular figure in order to put on a new play just seemed absolutely crazy by the time you get to the 1960s, but that was how it was. And the Lord Chamberlain's office was still absolutely able to censor prospective plays. They could demand of playwrights and theatre owners that anything they believed was immoral or inappropriate was removed before the play could be put on. If you're a theatre owner who decides this is absolute madness and we're going to put a show on anyway without a licence, you could potentially be prosecuted. And we know that increasingly during the 60s, authors, playwrights, filmmakers are addressing some of those social issues that previously they wouldn't have done. That sex and violence and swearing and nudity are increasingly acceptable in society. And so playwrights are putting those things into their plays, but the Lord Chamberlain's office is still telling them on occasion to take them out. Now, this comes to a head, this issue, in 1967, where there's a controversial new play by Edward Bond. It's called Early Morning, and the Lord Chamberlain's office bans it. And you've got an MP called George Strauss who says, look, this is the late 1960s. It's absolutely crazy that this is still going on. We need to abolish censorship of the theatre. So George Strauss introduces a bill to Parliament. He gets the support of Roy Jenkins. We know, of course, Jenkins is a very liberal Home Secretary, lends his support to all sorts of different social reforms, and this is yet another one. George Strauss also gets support from Laurence Olivier, who you may have heard of, a hugely respected actor at the time as well, and Parliament passes that bill. It becomes law in 1968. And quite an interesting little event happens not long after the bill becomes law. You get a performance of the musical Hair at the Shaftesbury Theatre in the West End, and the cast celebrate the fact that censorship has been removed by standing up, turning to face the audience entirely naked for at least a good 30 seconds. So not only has censorship been removed, but here is a particular play very much taking advantage of it. So a really clear example here of some quite significant social change within the 1970s. Another aspect of censorship that it's worth reflecting on is censorship in films and television. Now, the British Board of Film Censors, which still exists today, was responsible for categorising films, which it did very strictly, but as the 60s went on, even the film censors themselves began to recognise that society was changing, and their definition of what was acceptable and appropriate definitely became more liberal. And that's why we see, for example, films like Alfie with Michael Caine in 1966, Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush in 1967. Those are much more daring than the kind of films that would have got past the censors in the 1950s. And so we're not seeing the sort of battle that we saw when it came to theatre censorship. It's very clear that the film censors are moving with the times in a way that the Lord Chamberlain's office hadn't been doing. And that's why by 1970 it's a lot more common to see both sex and violence in films. Now, it's an interesting one because we'll see in a minute there were certain people like Mary Whitehouse who were appalled by this, and they said if you reduce censorship, it opens the floodgates and you're going to see sex, violence, swearing, nudity everywhere. It's a slippery slope. But what we're really seeing is that doesn't happen. It's not the case that all of a sudden every play or every film suddenly contains loads of violence or loads of swearing. Some do, some don't. What's really happening is the film censors kind of legitimising changes that have already happened. They're accepting that society has already changed. They're not leading the change, they're responding to the change. And it's certainly not the case that the floodgates open and it's impossible to see a film with no sex in it. It's just not the case. Worth reflecting briefly about TV as well. Again, we do see increased use of violent scenes, for example, on television, or sex scenes. Again, it's certainly not the case that every programme suddenly has them, but yes, there is a change there. But what we also see on TV is that certain political and religious issues which weren't discussed or debated on television because they were seen as too controversial in the past are now openly being discussed. And of course, politics has been reported for a long time on TV, but there had been a reluctance really to dig a bit deeper and to expose and discuss some of the more divisive political issues. And that's certainly true when it came to religion. And we can see on television as we go through the 1960s, that is certainly changing as well. So I mentioned a moment ago that not everybody was happy with these changes, and we increasingly hear this phrase, the permissive society, being used by people who are outraged by the extent of change that's happened. The permissive society, in other words, a society which allows anything to happen, which has no real controls on morality and on people's behaviour. And these critics will often be very condemnatory of politicians, particularly Roy Jenkins, but also of a lot of the media as well. So, first of all, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is quite prominent in some of its criticism of the so-called permissive society. In particular, in the 1960s, the Catholic Church takes aim at contraception and particularly the pill. And of course, traditional Catholic teaching says that sex is for procreation, for the creation of children only, and clearly the pill stands in opposition to that. So the official Catholic line is very much against contraception. That doesn't mean that every Catholic in the pews takes that line, and it's quite interesting. You get a Conservative MP who's a Roman Catholic called Norman St John Stevas, and he writes an article called The Pope, the Pill and the People, nice bit of alliteration, in 1968, and that argues against the official line. So don't think that every single Catholic or Christian or person of religious belief is against these more liberal changes, but it's certainly true that the official position of the Church remains quite conservative with a small c. Now, we mentioned Mary Whitehouse a moment ago. Mary Whitehouse is, and certainly likes to present herself as your average British woman, your average British housewife. She's certainly, although she's very critical of the media, very media savvy. She's very good at using the media, and she becomes a really prominent figure on all sorts of talk shows, for example, during the 60s and beyond as well. She goes on well into the 70s and 80s and 90s as well. Mary Whitehouse believes that there's far too much sexual freedom. She points in particular to the rising rates of sexually transmitted infections. She's not made that up. It was certainly the case that it was true, but that's something that she takes aim at. But Mary Whitehouse's focus above all is the media, the way the media behaves and the increasingly liberal attitudes of part of the media. And Mary Whitehouse sets up her own organisation. Her argument is that I am an ordinary British housewife, but I represent the views of so many of the British people. And you can see that from the name of her organisation. It's called the NVLA, the National Viewers and Listeners Association, set up in 1965. And it's absolutely the case that plenty of people do agree with Mary Whitehouse. Very quickly gets 100,000 members. Does it have an impact on what the BBC and ITV decide to do? Well, no, it doesn't. So it's quite interesting. Mary Whitehouse's profile and arguably her popularity are very significant, but the actual impact that she and her organisation have is extremely limited. And as we move into the 70s, we see a continuation of this much more liberal approach, whether it's television, whether it's radio, whether it's films, or whether it's theatre. And this final point here is quite an interesting one, because if you were to believe everything that Mary Whitehouse said, then you'd imagine that pretty much every young person in Britain was having sex all the time, that they were out there taking drugs, swearing all the time, and that the media had made them do that. But if we look at these surveys by Schofield and Gora in 65 and 69, actually it appeared that most young people married their first sexual partner. Many hadn't had sex at all by the time they got married. So actually, far from more liberal attitudes in the media, meaning that everybody suddenly behaved in a so-called permissive way, actually, even among young people, relatively traditional attitudes remain strong. And it's a theme we keep on coming back to, that the 50s and the 60s are a time of significant social change, but more traditional attitudes absolutely haven't disappeared, despite what critics of the permissive society might argue. I referred a moment ago to the increased use of drugs during the 1960s, and this is something we need to talk about briefly, as well as considering how Wilson's government responded to that. It's certainly the case that the stereotype of the 60s, where drugs become more common, particularly softer drugs like cannabis, that stereotype has some basis in truth. Certainly, cannabis and to an extent LSD are increasingly accessible. Their use does become more common in the 1960s, and they are very much part of that hippie flower power culture. It's also true that the Beatles, of course, dabble in LSD, even though they deny that their Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds song is a homage to that drug. It's also the case that, although they're less widespread, more people are using so-called hard drugs like cocaine and heroin than they had done in previous decades, and the statistics tell their own story. In the early part of the 60s, addiction to heroin and cocaine increases tenfold. So clearly there is a rise in what we might want to call drug culture. And Wilson's government responds to this. Now, we've often talked about Wilson's government being pretty liberal-minded. When we looked at Roy Jenkins' period as Home Secretary, that was especially the case. But we've also commented before that that's not true of Wilson himself, and it's particularly not true of Jim Callaghan. And when we look at what the government does, we can see actually a relatively conservative approach to the possession and particularly the supplying of drugs as well. First of all, there's the Dangerous Drugs Act in 1967, and that makes it unlawful to possess either cocaine or cannabis. We then get a report called the Wootton Report in 1968, and that says actually, only a year after this act, there is a case for legalising cannabis. Now, had Roy Jenkins been Home Secretary, maybe that would have been given more consideration. But Jim Callaghan is a traditionalist. He's a small c conservative when it comes to issues like drugs, and Callaghan, who's Home Secretary at the time, is absolutely against that proposal. So cannabis and possession of cannabis remains unlawful. And right at the end of the decade in 1970, there's a real crackdown on the supplying of drugs, and the maximum sentence for that goes up to 14 years in prison. And that brings an end to this video. It's clear, as we said in the 1950s, that the 60s is a time of really very significant social change. If we look, for example, at car ownership, TV ownership, increasingly liberal attitudes in the media, the rise in drug taking, all of those are undoubtedly aspects of change. But is it the case that there's been some kind of social revolution? Is it the case that society has become exceptionally permissive? Is it the case that everybody's attitude is suddenly very liberal? Absolutely not.
Huge thank you to Tom there for a really interesting video on UK societal change. There'll be more on this channel to come, so more in this particular playlist. Tom's going to be working hard putting together some more videos on this. There's also lots of other stuff going on in the channel in terms of A-level politics content and content on other history units on things such as American history and Russian history and Tudor history. So hopefully those are stuff there that you'll find helpful. Please remember to subscribe, like the video, and leave Tom some comments on this one. It would be absolutely great. Thank you very much.